An old woman trapped by a blizzard had nothing to eat, but when 15 roaring bikers appeared at her door, she welcomed them anyway. Snow hammered the little town into silence. Inside a small wooden house, Margaret sat by her fire, alone, mending a torn quilt. She was in her late 70s, silver hair pulled back neatly, glasses slipping down her nose. The cupboard was bare, the pantry empty, yet the warmth of the heart and the memory of a husband who once filled the house with laughter kept her company. Outside, the storm raged, relentless and merciless. Suddenly, a sound cut through the wind, a low, uneven rumble that made her pause. Engines? She frowned, put down the quilt, and pushed herself to her feet, shuffling to the frost-covered window. The snow stung her cheeks as she wiped a clear patch with the back of her hand. And then she saw it. Headlights flickered through the swirling white. 1, 2, 3, no, more. 15 motorcycles crawled up the hill, a convoy of steel beasts defying the storm, engines growling against the night. Leather-clad figures hunched over handlebars, patches glinting dimly. Most people would have bolted, locked doors, and hoped the storm swallowed them whole. But not Margaret. Despite the empty pantry, despite the bitter cold, she whispered softly, "Lord, what on earth are you sending me tonight?" and moved to open the door. Moments later, the pounding came. Heavy fists against her wooden door. She gripped the handle, pulse quickening, and cracked it open. Snow gusted inside, stinging her face. Towering men stood on her porch, beards thick with ice, jackets crusted in snow. Their leader stepped forward, eyes dark, voice rough but respectful. "Ma'am, we don't mean trouble. Roads closed behind us. Bikes are freezing up. We just need a place to warm up before we lose someone out here." For a long moment she stared. These were HELLS angels, or something like the men the town whispered about in fear. Outlaws, rebels, dangerous. But what Margaret saw was 15 human beings, shivering, cheeks raw from wind, desperation in their eyes. She opened the door wider. "Well, don't just stand there freezing. Come in before you all turn into icicles." The bikers hesitated, exchanging glances. Kindness wasn't something they met often, especially from strangers. Then one by one they stepped inside, boots stamping snow across her rug, leather creaking as they shook off the storm. The house seemed to shrink around them, her small living room swallowed by broad shoulders, patched jackets, and the smell of gasoline and snow. Margaret clapped her hands briskly. "Boots off by the fire, you'll ruin my floors. Hang those jackets on the rack, and if anyone smokes in here, you'll be back out in the snow before you can blink." The men looked at her, surprised, then chuckled. A giant with tattoos down his neck actually grinned. "Yes, ma'am." Boots thudded to the floor. Jackets were hung. Like oversized children, they obeyed. She bustled into the kitchen. Cabinets were bare, but she managed to put on a pot of soup, the scent of broth soon mixing with wood smoke. Meanwhile, the bikers thawed. One crouched to warm his hands, another leaned against the mantel, a third carefully righted a porcelain figurine he'd almost knocked over. Slowly, tension eased. For the first time that night, Margaret allowed herself to exhale. She poured soup into mismatched bowls, handed them out, and watched hardened faces soften as steam rose. "Best thing I've tasted in months," muttered one. Another added, "Haven't had home cooking since my mama passed." They ate in silence, broken by murmurs of thanks. And Margaret, watching them, remembered feeding hungry farmhands in her youth, remembered the pride in her husband's eyes when he said she had a gift for making strangers feel like family. Still, outside her walls, fear brewed. Down in town, a neighbor spotted the bikes roaring up her hill. Word spread fast. "She's got them in her house?" people whispered. "She's insane. They'll rob her blind. Maybe worse." Curtains twitched. Phones rang. Some even thought of calling the police, but no one dared brave the storm to check. They just shook their heads and prayed she'd be safe. Back at the house, the men relaxed. Laughter bubbled up, cautious at first, then louder. One pulled a harmonica from his pocket, playing a slow blues tune. Margaret tapped her foot, smiling. But she didn't miss the way some of them glanced at her photos on the mantel, her late husband in his younger days, standing proudly beside a gleaming motorcycle. She caught their eyes and chuckled. Yes, he rode too. Used to say, "Don't judge a rider by the leather. It's the man beneath that matters." The bikers fell silent, listening. Their leader, the one who had spoken first, leaned forward. What was his name? Henry, she said softly. Passed 10 years ago, but he would have let you in tonight. No question. The leader nodded. Sounds like a man we'd have followed. Hours slipped by. The storm outside deepened, but within those walls, something else grew, an unlikely warmth. Margaret moved among them with the authority of a grandmother and the patience of a saint. She scolded one for putting his feet on the table. She handed another a sewing kit when she noticed his vest torn, and they accepted it, even seemed to crave it. For a moment, these men, rough, scarred, feared, looked like sons who had found a place they hadn't known they were missing. By midnight, the fire burned low. Some stretched out on the floor, others dozed in chairs. Margaret tucked quilts over broad shoulders as though they were children. She returned to her own chair, sat, and whispered into the quiet, "Henry, I think you'd be proud tonight." The storm raged, but the house stood firm, filled with the unlikely sound of snores and peace. And as she drifted into a light sleep, she didn't know that her choice, her simple act of kindness, was about to echo far beyond her little home. For by morning, the world outside would never look at her the same way again. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. It helps us bring you more powerful, true-to-life tales just like this one. The night wore on, and the house that once felt too empty for Margaret now felt almost too full. Every chair, every scrap of rug space was claimed by broad-shouldered riders thawing out after the storm's beating. The fire popped and hissed, throwing shadows that danced across leather jackets and tired faces. Yet the strange thing was how natural it began to feel. For Margaret, the silence of widowhood had weighed heavy for years. Tonight, there was noise, rough laughter, muffled snores, boots shifting on wood. It was the sound of life, and it chased away the loneliness that had lingered for far too long. Still, doubts circled. She noticed one man scanning her shelves as if memorizing what she owned. Another slipped out a phone, texting fast, face unreadable. These weren't choir boys. They were men with records, reputations, and reasons for mistrust. Margaret kept her chin high, but her mind whispered the same questions her neighbors were surely asking. Had she just invited danger into her home? Around midnight, the power flickered. Lamps dimmed, then died, leaving only the fire. The room fell into an uneasy silence until the leader, a tall man with gray streaks in his beard, stood and moved toward the fireplace. "We'll keep it going," he said, tossing another log onto the flames. Sparks shot upward, light chasing back the dark. Margaret studied him, the quiet authority in his movements, the way the others deferred. Not just a leader, he was their anchor. As the storm deepened, small acts began to shift the air in the room. One biker with grease-stained hands noticed her furnace rattling. Without a word, he knelt, opened it up, and worked with a pocket toolkit until the groaning stopped. Another, lanky and restless, saw her chair wobble and tightened the loose leg with screws from his jacket pocket. These were simple things, but Margaret saw something underneath. Men used to fixing, building, surviving. For years they had been painted only as destroyers. Here they revealed a different truth. At one point, a crash echoed from the kitchen. Margaret hurried in, expecting disaster, but found two bikers crouched guiltily over a broken jar of preserves. "Sorry, ma'am," one muttered. She sighed, grabbed a rag, and waved them aside. "Next time, ask before raiding my pantry. You'll get more than you expect." They grinned sheepishly, cleaning up every shard. The longer the night went on, the more walls fell. Stories slipped out between sips of soup and the glow of the fire. A man with faded ink on his knuckles admitted he hadn't spoken to his daughter in years. Another confessed he'd spent time behind bars for mistakes he still carried like chains. One revealed he'd joined the club after losing his brother. The roar of the bike, the only thing that drowned out grief. Margaret listened without judgment. Her eyes softened, her hands busy with tea and blankets, but her heart open. She reminded them of the mothers some had lost, the grandmothers they barely remembered, the home-cooked meals they hadn't tasted in too long. And then came the moment that bound them tighter. Margaret pointed to the photograph of her late husband Henry standing proudly beside his motorcycle. His leather jacket was worn, his smile full of mischief. The leader leaned closer, voice low. He rode? Every mile he could, Margaret said. He always said, "Don't judge a rider by the leather. It's the man beneath that matters." The leader nodded slowly. Wise man. Another biker whispered, "Feels like he's still here, watching over this place." For the first time that night, Margaret's throat tightened. She hadn't heard anyone speak Henry's name with respect in years. Yet outside, suspicion brewed like the storm clouds overhead. Neighbors called one another, voices rising. She's harboring them. What if they're planning something? What if they turn on her? The local sheriff's office received more than one nervous call, but the roads were buried, and no deputy was about to drive a cruiser up the icy hill in the dead of night. So the house remained untouched, a pocket of warmth in a world frozen stiff with fear. Back inside, Margaret dozed briefly in her chair. She woke to find one of the men carefully stoking the fire so it wouldn't die out. Another stood by the window, watching the storm like a silent guard. They weren't asleep, not really. They were protecting her, in their own way. When she caught their eyes, they nodded, and she understood. They knew how much trust she'd given them. They weren't about to betray it. The night reached its midpoint. The storm outside screamed louder, shaking shutters, rattling glass. The house shivered. Food supplies dwindled. Margaret wondered if she had made a mistake. She stepped into the kitchen, hand pressed against the counter, whispering to herself, "Henry, what if I've been foolish? What if kindness was the wrong choice?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Ma'am." She turned. It was the leader, leaning against the doorway. "You're not foolish. You saw us for men, not monsters. That's rarer than gold these days." His voice cracked slightly, betraying something softer under the roughness. "Whatever happens tomorrow, we won't forget this night." Margaret swallowed hard, nodding. In that moment, she understood. This wasn't just shelter for them. It was redemption, a fleeting chance to feel human in a world that branded them outlaws. The hours crept by. Outside, snow buried their bikes, engines encased in ice. The storm showed no mercy. Inside, though, mercy had already been given, and it was rewriting the script of what this night would mean. As dawn threatened at the horizon, the fire still glowed, the storm still raged, and 15 bikers remained in the home of one brave, stubborn woman. They had come seeking warmth. They had found something deeper, and none of them, least of all Margaret, could guess what the morning would bring when the sound of engines returned, this time multiplied beyond imagination. Morning crept slowly, hidden behind thick clouds. The storm had not given up easily. Snow lay in drifts so high the porch seemed buried, and the bikes outside looked like strange frozen sculptures, chrome and steel sealed under ice. Margaret stirred from her chair, stiff from the long night. Around her, the riders were already awake, moving quietly. One swept ashes from the hearth, another boiled water on the stove. A third had gone outside to shovel a path through the waist-high snow, his beard coated white, breath fogging like smoke. Margaret rubbed her eyes, almost disbelieving what she saw. Men the town called criminals were tidying her home, cooking breakfast, and braving the elements for her sake. She whispered, "Henry, I wish you could see this." But as the morning light grew, reality pressed in. The food was nearly gone, her pantry picked clean. Power lines had snapped somewhere during the night, leaving the town dark. And though the men had behaved like respectful guests, The world outside would never see them that way. Trouble was coming, one way or another. The leader gathered the group. "Brothers, we'll dig out the bikes. Once the roads are clear, we ride. But before we do," he turned to Margaret. His voice dropped. "We owe you more than a thank you. You gave us a home last night. You treated us like men, not monsters." He extended a hand, rough and scarred. Margaret placed her small, wrinkled hand in his. "You needed help. That's all that mattered." The riders nodded, silent. Some looked away, eyes wet they wouldn't let anyone see. The morning hours dragged as they struggled to free the bikes from the icy grip. Engines sputtered, some refusing to turn. They pushed, cursed, laughed, worked together like a family used to hardship. Margaret stood on the porch, coat wrapped tight, watching them fight the snow. Something stirred in her chest, something she hadn't felt since Henry was alive. Pride. Then it happened. Just as the first bikes rumbled back to life, another sound rolled in over the valley. A deep, distant thunder. At first, Margaret thought it was the storm returning. But no, the storm had passed. This sound was different, louder, multiplying. Engines. Dozens of them. The riders stopped, heads snapping up. Their leader's eyes narrowed. One by one, the men turned toward the road below. Through the thinning curtain of snow, shapes emerged. Motorcycles. Dozens upon dozens, headlights blazing. The sound grew until the ground itself seemed to tremble. Margaret's breath caught. It wasn't 15 bikes now. It was close to 100. She gripped the porch railing as the line of machines crawled up her road. Engines revved, chrome gleamed. Men and women on bikes filled the horizon, black leather against white snow. They weren't here to fight. They were here in tribute. The 15 men she had sheltered stood straighter, their faces unreadable, but their eyes shining. One whispered, "They came." The leader turned to Margaret. "Word spread overnight. You showed kindness where nobody else would. The club doesn't forget things like that." Margaret's knees trembled. 100 bikers rolled to a stop outside her little wooden house, engines idling like a choir of thunder. One by one, riders removed their helmets, faces turned toward her. Some grizzled, some young, all marked by the road. And then, as if rehearsed, they nodded in unison, a gesture of respect. Tears stung Margaret's eyes. She had been alone for so long, ignored by neighbors, pitied by townsfolk. Now, in the silence after the roar, she realized she was no longer invisible. These men, feared by many, had come to honor her. The leader spoke again, voice carrying over the growl of engines. "From this day forward, you're family. No one touches this house. No one disrespects this woman. She is under our protection." Cheers erupted. Engines roared again, not in threat, but in salute. The snow-laden trees shook with the force of it. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, jaws dropping at the sight. The very people they feared had lined up not to terrorize, but to guard. And at the center of it all, one small woman stood with her chin high, warmed not by fire, but by the fierce loyalty of strangers who had become something more. Margaret raised a hand, trembling but steady. "Thank you. But remember, this wasn't about fear or power. It was about kindness, and you must carry it forward." The bikers listened. Some nodded solemnly. The leader smiled faintly. "We will." Engines revved once more, and slowly the 100 bikes turned, rolling down the hill in formation, their thunder echoing across the valley. Only the original 15 remained. They hugged Margaret one by one, awkward but genuine. Some left tokens behind, a patch, a bracelet, a promise. And then, with one final roar, they too rode off into the fading storm. Silence returned, but it wasn't the heavy silence of loneliness anymore. It was the silence after a promise, the silence of a house that had been touched by something larger than itself. Margaret closed her door, heart full, and whispered to the empty room, "Henry, I think I found a new family." And from that day on, the little house on the hill was never quite alone again. Word spread, stories grew, and while townsfolk still whispered, they did so with a different tone. Not pity, not fear, but awe. Because one winter night, a kind old lady opened her door to 15 bikers, and by morning, 100 stood at her side. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe and stay with us for more powerful tales of kindness, redemption, and the unexpected. And if you want to see what happens when compassion collides with the impossible, our next video is one you won't want to miss.